Hi guys, welcome to CADS 3853 module number 19. This module is going to be about, again, stock planning method, the third module on stock planning method. And this time we are going to take a look at the basic stock method. Again, this is the same slide we saw in the two previous modules when we talked about the SSR and week supply method. Here we're looking at the last basic stock method, last stock planning method. Okay, and as I said before, we need to plan the inventory efficiency before we plan the stock level. And each of these stock planning method uses a certain kind of inventory efficiency measure, right? SSR method uses the SSR or stock sales ratio, and the week supply method uses the turnover. And now the basic stock method is going to be again using turnover as the inventory efficiency measure. So the principle of the basic stock method of stock planning is that the inventory investment should be based on an assumption that there must be some kind of a minimum amount of stock, okay, which is what we call basic stock. That minimum amount of stock to be ensured to be on hand at all time, regardless of the sales. Okay, so basically, you want to assure that you're going to have at least this much of stock, the basic stock, much of stock will be left even after all the sales that you had planned are completed. So naturally, the planned stock level is going to be determined by the basic stock level plus the planned sales for the month. And that is going to indicate the BOM, again, beginning of month, stock level for each month. Okay, so this basic stock part is consistent. The amount is consistent across all months. Okay, if you're doing a 6-month planning for the entire season or planning that for all 6 months in the season, you're going to use the same basic stock method and plus the planned sales for each month. Okay, that figure is going to indicate the planned BOM for the month. In this way, even if you sell what you plan to sell, you will still have that basic stock left at the end of the month in the store, right? And I said the basic stock method uses the turnover, inventory turnover, as the efficiency measure to determine the stock level. And the turnover is actually used to determine the basic stock portion of the BOM. Because basic stock is calculated by subtracting the average monthly sales from the average inventory. And we know that the average inventory is used to calculate turnover, right? So once you know your turnover and the seasonal sales plan, then you can also calculate the average inventory based on this turnover and sales number. Then from which you can calculate basic stock. So knowing basic stock is average inventory minus average monthly sales, if we replace the basic stock portion of the planned BOM formula we just saw in the previous slide with this basic stock calculation formula, then the planned BOM will be equal to planned average inventory minus average monthly sales plus planned sales, right? And this parenthesized part in this formula is what we called basic stock in the previous slide. And remember that we used the turnover figure to calculate the average inventory because we learned that turnover is sales over average inventory, right? And then sales over average inventory at retail. So average inventory at retail will be net sales divided by turnover, right? So we can utilize that. We usually plan our seasonal sales and seasonal turnovers, and based on those two figures, we can calculate what our planned average inventory is going to be, and utilize that to calculate the basic stock and BOM. Another thing that you should make sure to be careful about is when you try to calculate the average inventory, the sales and turnover that you use in this formula will have to be consistent in terms of their periods. Okay, so if your turnover is seasonal turnover, then you will have to divide the seasonal sales by the seasonal turnover. If the sales are annual sales, then you're going to have to divide the annual sales by annual turnover. Okay, if the turnover is monthly turnover, then the sales has to be also monthly sales. So the sales and turnover figures to calculate the average inventory must be the same in terms of the period for which they were planned. So overall, to calculate the BOM or plan the BOM based on the basic stock method, it requires a multiple kind of steps of calculation because you first have to calculate the average inventory and then use that to calculate basic stock amount, and then you have to add in the planned sales to the basic stock amount to know what is going to be the BOM, right? So let's apply these steps of calculations to calculate to come up with our BOM plan for January in this example. Given the planned sales of $36,000 for the 6 months, so the entire season, and the seasonal stock turnover of 3, and planned sales for the month of January, being $9,000. So this plan, so you've got seasonal sales and seasonal turnover planned out, and also you know what is your plan for January sales for this year. If you know this, okay, then what would be the planned BOM stock for January if you use the basic stock method to plan stock levels? Just remember that average inventory is sales divided by turnover, and that's probably the first thing you need to calculate for you to be able to come up with your basic stock and then BOM stock. So average inventory first, and then basic stock, and then BOM in that order would be probably the best to go through to get to the right answer. Let's pause the video here while you guys work on it. Alright, so it was a little bit complex, wasn't it? Okay, let's work on it together. Okay. First, like I said before, it's best to start with the average inventory because we need that number to be able to calculate the basic stock level, right? So average inventory, in this case, the seasonal sales was given and the turnover for the season was given, right? So we can utilize these two numbers to come up with our average inventory plan. $36,000 seasonal sales for the 6 months planned out, and divide that by the 3 to turnover planned, and that gives us a $12,000 as the average inventory level. So that's average inventory at retail, right? Also, the basic stock is average inventory minus average monthly sales. So we need to first also know average monthly sale. We know the seasonal sales. So seasonal sales divided by 6 months, because the season has a 6 month, right? That will give us our average monthly sales, which in this case was $6,000. So now with given this average inventory and average monthly sales, we can calculate the basic stock as average inventory minus average monthly sale, which is $12,000 minus $6,000, which is $6,000. So now we're using this $6,000 as the basic stock to come up with our BOM stock level, right? $6,000 basic stock plus the planned sales for January. In this case, it was $9,000. So that gave us the idea that we need to plan to have $15,000 worth of merchandise at the beginning of January. So when would be most appropriate to use the basic stock method? The basic stock method is a really good method for planning stock levels for merchandise of which turnover is low and sales tend to be slow. We can say turnover is low when it is less than the number of months in the period for which the turnover is calculated. So that would be like when the seasonal turnover is less than 6 or the annual turnover is less than 12, and cases like that. When sales are that slow and the merchandise is moving through the store, very slowly like this, like a basic merchandise instead of the fashion merchandise. In that case, if we just plan the stock level like using the week supply method or something like that, then we may not be able to assure that we're going to have enough merchandise to even fill the fixture, right? Even though we may not be able to sell all these things at that, at a really fast rate, we still need to have the merchandise to be able to show to the customers that we have enough merchandise, right? And we don't want to look like our store is empty, right? So these basic stock or basic merchandise, they may not be really the most critical kind of the assortment part of the assortment in the store, but they need to be assured to be there in the store so that it will create the right balance between the basic and fashion merchandise. So for all these reasons, sometimes we may want to assure that, okay, these basic merchandise, we know that the sales are pretty slow on these particular items, but we know that these are not really affected by fashion changes much, so we can actually have a long period of time for which we can actually sell these items. So we are going to assure to have at least a minimum amount of the items that can fill the fixture there all the time, although they may not be selling, right? So for that reason, we want to use the basic stock method, which will allow us to be able to assure that at least as much as the basic stock will be there all the time, even if we sell as much as we plan to sell for each month. But you have to understand that this basic stock method can result in too much inventory during the slow month or for merchandise with low turnover, because the purpose was to assure that you are going to have sufficient amount of merchandise even for slow selling merchandise. So this method is going to allow you to have more inventory than you need to sell, right? Basically, and plus alpha. So that is the case. If you don't want that, if you don't have any need to build a fixture or something like that, and knowing that your items are not going to selling so fast, so you know that these items are going to have low turnover and you don't really need to build a fixture, then you may not want to use the basic stock method. Also, you need to remember that this method may result in too little inventory during busy month or for merchandise with really high turnover. Okay, high turnover means that items are really selling fast and fast through the store, right? Moves really fast through the store, and you are just assuring that you're going to have enough merchandise to cover the sales plus just a little bit of safety stock. And sometimes if the sales go unexpectedly well, then you may not have enough basic stock to support these additional sales that would have been able to be made if you had had more inventory prepared in the store. So for all these reasons, the basic stock method is more applicable to basic merchandise whose sales may be pretty slow, the turnover may be low, but you want to still assure that you have enough merchandise to fill the fixture and make it look like you've got those items in for customers who may need them and things like that. So have some limited usage. Alright, let's work on another basic stock practice problem just to assure that we are understanding the step-by-step procedure to get to the to calculate the BOM inventory level for each month. Okay, so now this is a candy department's inventory turnover is projected to be 4 during the fall season. So there is the seasonal turnover planned out, and the seasonal sales for this department were planned at $120,000. Okay, and with November sales anticipated to be $25,000. So there's a seasonal sales and the sales for the month of November. And let's calculate the BOM inventory for November using the basic stock method. Okay, so again, you need to try to calculate the basic stock and then add in the November sales plan to be able to plan the BOM of November, right? But first, to be able to calculate the basic stock, you need to know what the average inventory is. Okay, so let's start with the average inventory, and then average monthly sales, and then basic stock, and then finally get the BOM. Let's pause the video. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer together. Okay, first we wanted to calculate the average stock level by dividing the seasonal sales by seasonal turnover, right? Seasonal sales of $120,000 divided by seasonal turnover of 4, which gave us the average inventory of $30,000. Average monthly sales, since we have the seasonal sales and you divide that by 6 months, that will be your monthly sales on average, $20,000. Basic stock is the difference between the average inventory and average monthly sales. So $30,000 minus $20,000 equals $10,000. So planned BOM will be $10,000 plus $25,000 $35,000 planned for November. That gave us the $35,000 for the planned BOM stock level for November. Okay. So when we plan our stock level, okay, and plan our stock efficiency to be able to plan our stock level, as well as the stock planning method, which method we're going to choose to use for our planning our stock, we have to think about a lot of factors, right? For example, first we may have to think about how much safety stock we need, right? Do we have any need for filling the fixture, to assure that we have a certain amount of safety stock in the store all the time, even after we make all the sales that we plan to make for the month, something like that. If we do have the need for certain safety stock, that we have to assure that we're going to plan the SSR to be high enough to have the safety stock. Or if you use basic stock method, then we're going to be able to assure that that basic stock amount will be assured to be in the store even after we sell everything that we wanted to sell. Then of course we need to consider the type of merchandise we carry, and this probably is by far the most important thing, right? Because if we deal with fashion merchandise with high turnover, then we're going to have to probably go with the SSR method. If the merchandise is staple items that of which sales kind of are very constant, weeks to weeks, and throughout the year, in that kind of case, then we will probably want to use the week supply method. And if we are dealing with very low turnovers, low selling merchandise, so that we have to assure that we're going to need a certain amount of stock to be able to fill the fixture and just have them in the store all the time, even if they don't sell, then the basic stock method may be the way to go. Another important consideration is the question of what amount of merchandise is imported. Why would this be important? That's because if we are relying on a lot of the outsourcing of our merchandise from overseas contractors or overseas vendors, and like the country is really far away from us, like in China or some of the Asian countries or African countries and things like that, it takes quite a while for the merchandise to be shipped, right? So it's the lead time between the time that you place the order and the time that the merchandise actually is delivered to your store. Maybe it could be a month or many weeks, right? So if that's the case, a large portion of your merchandise is imported, that probably means that you have to ensure a little bit higher level of safety stock so that you're not going to be out of stock situation, right? So you have to think about that factor as well. Another critical factor in deciding on the stock planning method, as well as the amount of safety stock, is the width and depth of merchandise. We are going to talk about this width and depth of assortment later on, again in the assortment planning module. But let me briefly introduce you to these concepts. The width basically means, how variety of merchandise you have, right? How many styles of merchandise you have, how many colors and how many sizes, so the variation in your selection. Whereas depth of the merchandise means the number of units per this style, per color, per size, so per SKU. So if your assortment is narrow and deep, that means you don't carry a lot of different styles, but you go in depth, so you carry lots of units for the same style. Okay. If that's the case, that kind of assortment planning requires lower level of safety stock. Because when consumer wants to buy the style or the color, the size, that the variety, then since you're going with deep assortment, you have enough number of units to cover the demands. And if you see that SKU, that style, that color, that size is going really, really well, then you have enough time to order for a reorder for replenishment, right? So you don't have to carry really high safety stock. Whereas if your selection of assortment is going with this wide and shallow kind of planning, that means you have lots and lots of styles and colors and sizes, but for each color, size, style, you have only a few units. Okay, if that's the case, it requires a higher level of inventory, right? Even if you add just a few more units per the style, color, size, they will all add up to a really higher level of inventory. So that's the kind of thing, another thing that you have to think about, not only the type of merchandise, but how wide you're going with your assortment or how deep you're going with your assortment and things like that. That will also determine the level of inventory that you need to carry. Alright, this concludes module number 19. Okay, let's not forget to work on module problem assignment number 19. Okay, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.